It's a Tuesday night in a small town in Tennessee. The school board meeting starts at 7, and by 6:30, the parking lot is full. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzz over folding chairs in a room that was never meant to hold this many people. There are parents holding printed emails, teachers gripping coffee cups. A woman in the third row has a handmade sign that she keeps turning over in her lap like she hasn't decided yet whether to hold it up. On the agenda, a proposal to redirect public school funding to private institutions. The room smells like old carpet and anxiety. If you've been anywhere near a public school in the last few years, you know this scene. Maybe you've been in that room. Maybe you've watched it on the news and felt something tighten in your chest that you couldn't quite name. And know this fight is not new. It is, in fact, nearly 200 years old. And the people who started it, the people who first fought for the idea that every child in America deserves a public education, they faced the same arguments, the same opponents, and the same fear that it was all going to fall apart. They won anyway. This is the story of how and why it matters right now, today, more than it has in decades. I'm Laurie Stevenson, and this is Schooled, the history, power, and fight for public education.
To understand why public education exists, you have to understand what the world looked like without it. It's the 1820s in America. The country is 30, 40 years old now, still figuring out what it is. And if you want your child educated, you have a few options. None of them good if you aren't wealthy. You can pay for a private school, which means your child goes and the neighbor's children don't. You can send them to a church school if your church runs one and if the theology on offer matches your own. Or your child doesn't go to school at all, which for most families in most places is exactly what happened. Children of the poor were expected to stay poor. That wasn't cynicism. It wasn't even particularly controversial. It was just the order of things. You were born into a station, and you stayed there. The idea that a blacksmith's daughter might one day argue a case in a court of law, or that a farmhand's son might govern a state, that wasn't aspiration, that was fantasy. Then along came Horace Mann, and he said, "What if it doesn't have to be this way?" Horace Mann was born in 1796 in Franklin, Massachusetts. He grew up poor. His formal schooling amounted to about 6 weeks a year. The rest of the time, he educated himself in the public library that Benjamin Franklin had endowed for the town. That library changed his life. He never forgot it. In 1837, Mann was appointed secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, a position that had never existed before, in an office that had no staff and no budget and no real power. By any reasonable measure, it was not a job that was going to change the world. Horace Mann changed the world with it anyway. What Mann had was a vision and a word: common. He called them common schools, schools for the common people, free, universal, open to every child, regardless of what their father did for work or how much money their family had. Funded not by the families who used them, but by the community as a whole. Because the community as a whole, Mann argued, had a stake in the outcome. That last part was the radical piece. That you, a person without children or with children long grown, or with children in a private school, had a reason to care about the education of the child down the street you may have never met. Because democracy, Mann argued, is not self-sustaining. It requires something of the people who live inside it. It requires citizens who can read and reason and evaluate evidence, who can look at a politician's claim and ask, is that actually true? who can sit in a jury box and weigh testimony, who can walk into a voting booth and make a choice that is genuinely their own. You can't do these things if you can't read. You can't do them if no one ever taught you how to think critically. And you certainly can't do them if the only education available to you costs more than your family earns in a month. Public schools, Mann said, don't just teach children. They produce citizens. And without citizens, you don't have a democracy. If you're expecting me to tell you that Horace Mann rolled out this vision and America embraced it with open arms, I'm going to have to disappoint you. The backlash was immediate, and it will sound, I promise you, deeply familiar. Private school operators saw a direct threat to their business model. If the government was going to provide free education to every child, who was going to pay tuition? Religious communities, particularly those who ran their own schools, objected to the idea of non-sectarian public education. If the school wasn't teaching their faith, what exactly was it teaching? And wealthy families, comfortable with the system that already worked quite well for them, raised a question that has echoed across 2 centuries of American political life. Why should I pay for someone else's child? It's worth sitting with that question for a moment because it sounds like common sense. It sounds like a reasonable objection. It sounds like a man who has worked hard for his money asking why he should fund the education of a stranger's kid. Mann had an answer, and it's the same answer that the evidence has been providing ever since. Because that child is going to grow up, and when they do, they are going to be your neighbor, your employee, your doctor, your juror, the person driving the other car on the highway, the voter in the next booth. An ignorant society is an expensive society. It pays in crime, in poverty, in civic dysfunction, in the slow erosion of the institutions that make commerce and commodity possible. You don't pay for public education out of charity. You pay for it out of self-interest, enlightened self-interest, the kind that can see past the next corner to the next generation. Mann took those arguments on the road. He traveled Europe studying school systems in Prussia and elsewhere. He wrote annual reports, 12 of them, that laid out his vision in meticulous, passionate detail. He lobbied, he cajoled, he made enemies, and outlasted them. By the time Horace Mann died in 1859, the common school movement had spread across the country. Massachusetts had a functioning public school system. So did New York, Ohio, Michigan. Other states were following. The idea had taken root. It was imperfect, profoundly, shamefully imperfect. Black children were excluded in most places. Girls were admitted, but often tracked toward domestic education rather than academic. Immigrant children were frequently subjected to schools designed to strip them of their language and culture rather than genuinely educate them. The promise was real. The delivery was deeply uneven. But the promise itself, that every child deserves an education, that public schools are a democratic institution and not a market commodity, that promise survived. And every subsequent generation has had to fight to expand it and fight again to keep it. Here's something worth knowing about the founding generation. They were afraid. Not of the things we usually talk about, foreign invasion, economic collapse. They were afraid of something more insidious, something that could hollow out a democracy from the inside. Thomas Jefferson called it aristocracy. Not the European kind with titles and estates, the American kind. Inherited wealth, accumulating quietly across generations, concentrating power in fewer and fewer hands until the men at the top were untouchable, not by law, but by money, by the schools their children attended, by the connections those schools provided, by the doors that opened for the children of the privileged and stayed closed for everyone else. Jefferson believed education was the only real counter to that drift. He called it the natural aristocracy, not of birth or wealth, but of virtue and talent. And he believed those qualities were distributed across the population regardless of class. The brilliant child of a poor family was out there. The future statesman, the gifted scientist, the inspired teacher. And if you didn't educate that child, if you allowed accident of birth to determine who got access to knowledge, you were robbing yourself. You were robbing the Republic. That was Thomas Jefferson in 1779. Let me tell you what it looks like in 2026. Right now, one of the most reliable predictors of a child's future income in America is the zip code they were born into. Not their intelligence, not their work ethic, not their talent or their drive or their character. Their zip code. Because, see, your zip code determines your property tax base, and your property tax base determines your school budget. Your school budget determines the quality of your teachers, the condition of your building, the availability of advanced courses, the presence of a school counselor, the technology available. Jefferson's warning was not a historical curiosity. It is a live description of our present day. And here is what makes the current moment different from every previous chapter of this story. For the first time in American history, there is a well-funded, strategically coordinated movement with a clear paper trail and identifiable architects, specifically designed to accelerate that inequality. To take the gap between what a rich child's education looks like and what a poor child's education looks like and make it permanent. To convert the common school, Horace Mann's radical, democratic, genuinely American idea, into a market. We're going to spend several episodes following that trail, and what we find is going to surprise you, as it should. But take hold of this first. Horace Mann won. He was one man with no budget and no staff and a vision that the powerful people of his time thought was dangerous. And he won. Not completely, not without cost, not in a way that was ever finished or secure, but he moved the country. The parents in that room in Tennessee on that Tuesday night, they are a part of a line that goes back to Mann, and before Mann to Jefferson, and before Jefferson to the simple, stubborn belief that a child's future should not be determined by the accident of which family they're born into. That belief has survived 200 years of opposition. It has survived people who called it government overreach, and people who called it socialism, and people who calculated that an ignorant public was more profitable than an educated one. It has survived because ordinary people, not politicians, not billionaires, not think tanks, kept showing up in rooms with buzzing lights and folding chairs, and holding signs that they decided to raise. Public schools belong to all of us. They always have. In the next episode, we're going to talk about what it costs to make that word all mean something. Because for most of this country's history, the public in public education was a very narrow category, and the people who forced it open did not do so easily. That's next time. Schooled is written and narrated by Laurie Stevenson. If you liked this episode, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to do more than listen, we'll have resources linked in the show notes. See you next week.